Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. I thank everybody that's involved with this process because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers.
Experience is not about the publisher, it is about us, the authors.
Good evening and welcome to my little talk about my book. My name is Barbara Hannon and this is the book that I wrote. You can see it. This is called Letters from World War II. It is the story of what happened to my parents during World War II from 1941 to 1945. So the story really unfolds through their letters. And I always tell people when they ask me why I wrote a book, I consider myself an accidental author. I never set out to write a book. In my retirement, writing a book was never on my list of all the things that I might do in my retirement. Writing a book was not part of it. But what happened is quite a story on why I wrote this book. So this is the story of what my parents went through during World War II from 1941 to 1945. And I will tell you that growing up with my three sisters, we had absolutely no idea what my parents went through in World War II. I think, like a lot of people in their generation, once the war was over, and especially if horrible things had happened, once it was over, they sort of put it out of their mind and never talked about it. My parents never talked about it. They never sat down with my sisters and I and said, this is what your father and I went through during World War II. The only interesting thing that we knew about World War II growing up is that, and I put this in the book, my family celebrated Jump Day every January 11th. Every January 11th. I can see my dad still. He would come down from upstairs and come into the kitchen and he'd look at all of us and go, it's Jump Day, let's have pancakes. It was that big a deal, Jump Day. What we knew about Jump Day as little kids was that our dad jumped out of an airplane with a parachute and he landed in the snow and he took his parachute off and buried it in the snow and started walking. And then he and the other guys on the plane were picked up by what he called the German police. And then he was in a prison camp. He never called it prison. It was always prison camp. So when we were little kids and asked him about prison camp, he would say, well, you know, we slept in cabins and we had bunk beds and we cooked our food outside sometimes and we played games and we played baseball teams. You know, to young kids like us, it sounded quite a bit like summer camp, doesn't it? So my dad jumped out of a plane and then was at summer camp. And that's about the extent of what we knew as kids, little kids. And as we got older, we knew that he was a navigator on a B-17 bomber, and he was stationed somewhere and flew bombing missions over Germany. And on one of his missions, his plane was shot down and he jumped out and was captured and then spent the rest of the time in a German prisoner of war camp. That's about the extent of what we knew because my parents didn't talk about it. And I think when my sisters and I talked about it when I was starting to write this book, none of us ever really had the sense that there was anything bad, that it was horrible. We had no idea. And that was astonishing to me when I found out the story. So what happened was my sisters and I were cleaning my mother's house out after she died. And we thought we knew everything that was in the house, but we didn't. And in the very back of her bedroom closet, we found 2 boxes. One of them was about this big. And I opened this box and it was full of letters. They were tied with little ribbons and in groups. And I opened the second box, and the second box was full of documents. And I remember briefly sort of picking up some of these documents, and they were telegrams. They were War Department pieces of information. There was even a commendation from Winston Churchill to my dad, the lead navigator on 3 bombing missions in October. And I looked at these and I thought, wow, these are really incredible. My dad did not throw away anything from the war. So my plan was to take the boxes, take them to my house, and when I retired, I would go through them. And then COVID hit, and I kind of needed a project. So one morning I made a pot of coffee and started going through these boxes. And within just a few minutes, I was stunned. I looked at this box of letters, and the first group of letters I recognized from Santa Ana Air Base. That's where my dad went to navigator school. The second group of letters were from a place called Ridgewell, England, in Essex. The third group of letters were astonishing. I picked them up and they were long and thin and folded, and they had German writing all over the front of them. They said Mit Luftpost, and my dad's name was there. It said POW, prisoner of war, number 2172. And I opened the first one and let it sort of fall. I guess I never realized that my dad was able to write my mom letters from this prison camp. And then the fourth group of letters I picked up, and I looked at the return address, and it said St. Valery, France. France! I said to my, when was he in France? How did he get to France? He was in a German prison camp. Suddenly he's in, I didn't know the story. So I put the letters aside and I began looking at the documents. And the very first thing I picked up out of this box was a telegram from the War Department to my mother that said, your husband, Second Lieutenant George A. Hannon, has been missing over Germany since January 11th. January 11th, I knew was Jump Day, but the telegram came on January 26th. And I thought, knowing Jump Day was the 11th, my mother did not know until January 26th that he was even missing, that he was somewhere, something happened. Then I found the second telegram from February 18th. And it said, "Dear Mrs. Hannon, the Secretary of War would like me to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant George Hannon, has been reported as a prisoner of war of the Germans." That's all it said. It didn't say where he was or how he was. It just said, "Your husband has been reported as a prisoner of war." You know, I thought about that and I thought, January 26th to February 18th, knowing he had jumped out of the plane, Jump Day, January 11th, my mother did not know for 37 days that my dad was dead or alive. And I thought about her getting up every morning. She taught school in a high school, and she had to take a long bus ride to get to this high school. And I thought about her day after day for 37 days, getting up, going through life, the mundane stuff of every day. And she didn't know. She didn't know if he was dead. She didn't know if he was alive. But then in February, at least she heard that he was a prisoner of the Germans. But what does that mean? I just thought so much about her. And then it was not until April 17th, 1944, that she finally got a telegram from the government, the War Department, that said, yes, he was a prisoner of war at Stalinluft 1 prison camp in Germany. So I just thought so much about my mother, not knowing day after day after day. So she finally knew where he was, but I then became pretty obsessed with this whole story. And from being a child and not really knowing where he was and that he was in this prison camp, I think in my mind, I thought he was there over the summer. He was in summer camp. I realized that my dad was in this prison camp for 16 months. And I just began to think about this separation. So knowing that my dad was in this German prison camp for 16 months, I kind of backed up the story. My parents were married June 19th, 1943. And in August, my dad sent a letter that said he had just arrived in England. August. So from June until June 1945, my parents were separated for 2 years. And the only thing they had were their letters. Their whole relationship was based on these 80 letters. So I kind of put together the timeline and then decided to start reading some of these letters that they wrote to each other. And it was so difficult. It was so difficult. First of all, you don't expect your parents to write letters like these. And they were stunning. They had these pet names for each other. My dad would write from prison camp, "Dear Pumpkin, how are you doing?" I just became engrossed in the letters, letter after letter. And I realized that this was not an easy time for my parents. And I kind of became a detective. I wanted to figure out what happened to my dad. What happened? Why was his plane shot down? What happened to him? after his plane was shot down. What was it like in this prison camp? And I had to do a fair amount of research to figure this out. And some of the research I did was really heartbreaking. I, from a historical point of view, I don't know if people today realize that the 8th Air Force lost more airmen during World War II than the Marine Corps lost. It was brutal getting up in those planes day after day on these bombing runs, being chased by German fighter pilots and flak exploding everywhere. And I read in one book that airmen in late 1943 and 1944, when my dad was there, had a 1 in 4 chance of surviving the war. And of course, my dad was shot down on his 16th mission. And thankfully, he was captured and in a prisoner of war camp. But just the stunning numbers of how many people were lost. And I was reading some of his letters from England, and he clearly in these letters was frightened. You know, he wrote to my mother, "It gets harder and harder to get up in the plane every day because your life hangs in the balance and you don't know what's going to happen." And I thought about him in this plane doing this day after day after day, and this unbelievable sense of pride in my dad came out of nowhere. I was just stunned, and I was proud of his behavior. And my parents, in these letters, my dad is missing. My dad is in a German prison camp. My mother doesn't know where he is. And yet, when they were able to write letters to each other in prison camp, not one letter, not in one single letter, do they complain? Are they angry? There is nothing. It's just these positive letters really focused on the future. When the show is over, my dad would write, "We'll have a great life." One of the most poignant things from their letters is that every Christmas Eve, he wrote her, she wrote him, the same thing. And they would say to each other every Christmas, "I think this is the last year we'll be apart. Next year we'll be together at Christmas, and then we'll never be apart again." Well, of course, in 1943 and 1944, they weren't together, and it'd be another year. But they were so positive. You know, in one letter from England, my dad had just done his 15th mission. He needed 25 before he came home. And he wrote my mother with such positive energy, "Maybe I'll be home for Easter." But of course he wasn't. So I decided I wanted to do something with all of these documents. My dad there were telegrams, there were flight records, there were all of his prisoner of war documents from the prison camp in Germany. And I had someone that I knew who spoke and read German translate these prisoner of war records. And he turned the page over, and on the back of one of the documents, he pointed out this list. And he said, "Barbara, these are punishments." Punishments? Yeah, your dad was punished all these times by the Germans for who knows what. And that was my first kind of indication that maybe living in this prison camp for 16 months was horrible. The other thing that I noticed was there were medical records in this box, and the very first medical record was from Santa Ana Air Base, right at the beginning when my dad went to flight school, and he weighed 164 pounds. When he came home from the war, he had a medical exam, and his weight was 132 pounds. And he told the physician that he thought he had gained 20 pounds back. This was in August. And I thought about that. Wait a minute. My dad was starving in this prison camp. So then I did just unbelievable research on Stalag Luft 1, POW camp, German prison camp. It was clear up north on the Baltic. At the end of the war, there were almost 9,000, mostly U.S. 8th Air Force airmen, lieutenants, colonels, second lieutenants. They were all officers, commissioned officers. And there were about 1,000 British RAF officers there. And so there were about 9,000 guys trapped up there, and they were trapped. And a lot of them were interviewed after the war, and you can read all of their interviews. They're available. And I started reading some of these things, and it was horrible. They were starved. They were punished by the Germans as the war got worse, and the Germans felt that they might be losing. They became more brutal. I had no idea what my dad went through. And then I became obsessed with trying to figure out how he got out of this prison camp. And I will tell you that if you want to know the mystery on how these 9,000 airmen were rescued, you got to read the book. You got to read the book. It almost didn't happen. I wouldn't be here, if my dad had ended up in Russia. You got to understand where my dad's prison camp became Russian territory in East Germany. So it was not a very safe place to be at the end of the war. So I immediately had to do a lot of research, and I did a lot of research on the camp. I did a lot of research on the 8th Air Force. And I have to tell you, this was so bizarre. I ordered a book on the history of the 8th Air Force and the 381st Division, and I turned a page, and there was my dad's plane. And it was a history of what happened to many of their planes. And it was from the National Archives. You can find out what happened to every plane that was lost in World War II. But I'm reading this paragraph in this book, and it said, Lieutenant George Hannon got up from his navigator table after they lost 2 engines to check on the radio operator and found him dead. He had been strafed, he was cold, he was blue. The Lieutenant Hannon determined that they could not parachute him out of the plane because he was deceased. And I remember reading that and saying to one of my sisters, didn't Dad tell us that everybody got out of the plane? And my sister said, yeah, we asked him on jump day. Well, did everybody get out? My dad said, oh, yeah. Not true. So it was, writing this book was a detective, required being a detective. And as I began to put the story together, I started writing it, and it ended up as a book. And I wanted to tell the story because it's historic. I wanted to tell the story because I have such pride in my parents and what they did and how they handled this horrible situation. I wanted to tell it because it's an enduring love story. My parents' letters, I can see where these letters to my dad in this prison camp lifted his spirits. My mother was an incredible letter writer. And I wanted to tell the story because I think people should know what this generation went through. And I think my experience overall was I did not know the story. And sometimes I thought, if I could have just asked my mother lived to be 93. I could have just asked her, hey, tell me what happened. But I didn't know there was a story there. I didn't know there was a story to be told. And it is a story. It's a story about how they dealt with this. It's a story about how they cared for each other through letters. It is a story that is very historical, especially about the 8th Air Force and what their life was like, bombing every day. My dad talks about it in his letters. And it's a story about how they were rescued at the end of the war. And I am very proud to have told the story. And as I said, I never started out to write a book. It just kind of happened. And I'm very proud of the book. I am very proud of my parents' story. This is their picture. This is their when they were married. And my dad had just graduated from navigator school. And I just think stories like this need to be told because we shouldn't ever forget what this generation did. So anyway, someone is asking me here about my dad's traumatic war experiences. You know, as I look back, I can see some things with my dad. My dad was a food hoarder. At any given day in my house, there was enough food to feed an army. And he was kind of focused on food. He'd get very upset if his daughters did not eat something. And he would say things like, if that was the only food you had to eat, you'd eat it. But at the time, it went right over our heads. You know, and the other thing was fireworks. Never take us to see fireworks. He just could not have anything to do with fireworks. And when they were in this prison camp, I discovered toward the end of the war, they were pretty isolated up there. There was a concern by these POWs, like my dad, that nobody knew they were up there. They were clear up on the tip of the Baltic. And they were mostly concerned because they were afraid the Russians didn't know they were there and might bomb the camp. And so all this artillery and stuff started toward the end of April, and they didn't know who it was. They didn't know if it was the Americans, the British, the Germans, or the Russians. So it was a very interesting time. And I think it's a good story. It's certainly historical. So I just think that we should just not forget what these people lived through and what they did. So I told this story so people could read it. So are there anybody want to know anything else? So what I did, the letters in the book drive the romance. How did you set the mood? What I did in this book, because the very first telegram to my mother on January 26th that said, the Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your husband, Second Lieutenant George Hannon, is missing over Germany. I started the book from that point. And I know it's interesting, if you've ever seen a World War II Western Union telegram, it says the exact time that Western Union got that message, and then it says when it was delivered. So it was a two gold star telegram, which means Western Union would have delivered it to my mother within minutes of receiving it from the government, from the War Department. So it arrived at 1:20 on a Sunday. So all I kept thinking about was my parents, or my mother and my grandparents would have been eating Sunday dinner. They would have gone to church, come home, and they would have been eating Sunday dinner at 1:26 when there would have been a knock on the door. And my grandfather would have gotten up and gone to the door. And then they would have handed my mother this 2-star telegram. So I started the book from there and tried very hard to get a feeling from her. She was devastated, I'm sure. And then from there, I kind of backtracked to what happened to make him missing in action. I got on a plane and I went over to Essex, England, and went to the very air base, which is still there. You can see the runways, everything. Talked to the museum curator about what it was like to be a navigator on a B-17 in 1943 and 1944. I walked around this air base, stood in the same spot my dad would have been at. And then this last fall, I went to North Germany, where the prison camp was. And the land where the prison camp was in Germany is still there. There are some memorials there. The guy who runs, the curator of the camp, walked me through exactly where my dad's barracks would have been, where the guard towers were, what my dad would have been able to see every day from this camp. And it was stunning. It was stunning to actually be in the same spot that my dad was at. So it's been an emotional journey, but really well worth it. And one of the other reasons that I wrote this book is I want my parents' grandchildren and now great-grandchildren to know the story and know what he did. So I wrote it for them, but I'm hopeful that other people might read the story and just remember this generation. Remember this generation. I think people today cannot understand what it was like for someone like my mother, who was separated day after day for a long time, didn't know, and yet got up every morning, got through her life. I just think people need to know the story. So that's why I wrote it. Okay. You know, I have 2 messages about war. I think the first is actually a quote from my dad, which is, war is hell. War is never good. Never. Not the answer to solve problems. But if it happens, I think people today maybe have lost a sense of what commitment is about. You know, my dad went to flight school, was a navigator, because he was committed to the war effort and to help and to do something for his country. And he did it without question, without whining, without ever one word of anger in his letters, ever. And I think that kind of absolute commitment we don't maybe see as much today. And the lack of whining. People sometimes get angry about the smallest little thing. I experience that sometimes daily about these little things. And to say to them, my parents had some pretty big things to deal with. Never any anger, never any whining, never any poor me, never any why did I sign up to do this? Never. It was just this commitment. My dad said in one of his letters, I'm going to do this. I signed up for this, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, no matter what happens. That's a pretty good statement of commitment. So thank you. If you want to share and recommend your book to friends, I have gotten messages from a number of people like myself whose parents or grandparents were involved in the war, and they came across papers or letters, and emailed me and asked me what they should do with them. And, when my sisters and I first started reading the letters, I felt, we felt kind of like voyeurs, reading these very personal letters, dear Pumpkin and love, but my mother, before she died, made a huge effort to get rid of stuff in the house she lived in for 60 years. She would call us and say, oh, I have some more boxes for Goodwill. I want you to throw this stuff away. She was slowly getting rid of stuff. She never got rid of these letters, and she never got rid of these documents. She left them in her closet for her daughters to find. And I think she wanted us to read them. And I think she wanted us to know what happened. And I think she wanted to know the love that our parents had for each other. While she was alive, I think she just could not talk about it. But I am pretty sure that she left these for us. Otherwise, she would have gotten rid of them. But she wanted us to have them, which is why I say to people who find this kind of stuff in their parents' house, you must chronicle it. You must save it. You must, even if you just digitally scan everything to preserve it, you must save this stuff. You must read this stuff. You must tell the story, because without stories like this, I don't think we get better as a country until we really look at what this generation did. Okay. Anybody have any other questions? Thank you for the questions. It's hard kind of, to talk about your book for a half hour. So it is, it was nice to have some people ask some questions. So. Thanks for listening. Please read my book. Maybe you'll learn something interesting.